The night Abraham Lincoln died. Nothing dramatic announced itself. There were no signals meant to gather attention, no immediate sense that history had shifted its weight. People finished their evenings as they always had, unaware that the ordinary rhythm of the night had already been interrupted. News did not arrive as an event. It arrived slowly, carried by footsteps, whispers, and the hesitation of those unsure how to speak first. When word finally moved through the city, it did not bring clarity. It brought stillness. Conversation stopped partway through sentences, and lamps remained lit longer than usual. Some people waited for confirmation that never felt complete. Others simply sat where they were, sensing that something irreversible had occurred, even if the shape of it was not yet understood. Morning did not correct the feeling left by the night. Light revealed streets unchanged, yet the air felt heavier. The routines of the day resumed without confidence. People read the same notices again and again, as if repetition might make the meaning settle. Grief did not arrive all at once. It spread gradually, leaving space for disbelief to remain beside it. As details became clearer, a practical question emerged quietly. How should the country say goodbye? There was no urgency in the discussion, only caution. Every option felt incomplete. The loss was too recent, too widely shared, to be shaped quickly into ceremony. Decisions were delayed, not from confusion, but from an instinct to proceed without forcing resolution. Eventually, a plan formed without announcement. The body would travel, not as spectacle and not as display, but as passage. The idea was simple enough to be accepted without argument. It allowed distance to participate in mourning. It gave time a role, letting the movement itself carry part of what words could not yet hold. The route followed familiar lines, places already connected by rail and routine. There was no need to invent anything new. The country already knew these tracks. What changed was the attention given to them. Stations prepared without ceremony, unsure how many would come or what would be expected when the train passed through. Nothing about the preparation felt theatrical. Flags were arranged, rooms cleared, and schedules adjusted. People worked quietly, aware that they were contributing to something larger than instruction allowed them to describe. The absence of celebration shaped the mood. This was not an arrival that asked to be greeted, but a movement meant to be witnessed briefly and then allowed to continue. As the departure approached, uncertainty remained. No one knew how the journey would be received or whether it would be remembered at all. The intention was modest, to carry the body across a country still learning how to speak to itself after loss. The rest was left undefined, entrusted to the ordinary passing of time. When the train finally moved, it did so without emphasis. There was no moment designed to mark the beginning. Motion replaced waiting, and the decision became real only after it was already underway. Those nearby noticed the change and then returned to their places, aware that something had started, but unsure how far its effects would travel. The journey itself did not promise meaning. It offered continuity. The rails accepted the weight without adjustment, and the schedule held as closely as it could. What mattered was not precision, but presence. The train moved because that was what trains did, and in that familiarity, grief found a way to remain steady. Cities and towns along the route prepared in their own ways. Some gathered early, Others waited without planning. There was no instruction that fit every place. What united them was attention. People watched without expectation, allowing the moment to pass through without interruption or demand. Not every stop was marked, and not every witness felt the same. Some saw little more than a distant shape moving through the dark. Others remembered the sound more clearly than the sight. The experience did not insist on agreement. It allowed each place to receive it according to its own quiet measure. The journey itself did not begin with drama. There was no announcement meant to gather a crowd, and no pause designed to invite attention. The train departed as others had before it, following rails already worn smooth by routine. What made it different was not how it moved, but how closely it was watched, as if familiarity itself had taken on new weight. Along the first stretches of track, the movement felt ordinary. Signals changed, crossings cleared, and the sound of wheels carried outward in expected patterns. Those nearby did not react immediately. They noticed, then continued what they were doing. Only later did some realize that they had been listening more carefully than usual, aware of the sound without knowing why. As the train reached larger towns, waiting took on different shapes. Some people arrived early and stood quietly. Others watched from windows or doorways, uncertain whether their presence was required. There was no shared instruction. Attention gathered without coordination, held together by timing rather than by purpose or display. Not every city received the passage in the same way. In some places the train slowed briefly. In others it continued without pause. The pattern was practical, shaped by schedule and track conditions. Yet those who watched rarely spoke of these details later. What remained was the experience of being passed by, rather than the record of how it happened. Many remembered the sound more clearly than the sight. At night, the outline of the train was difficult to hold, but the rhythm of its movement traveled farther. The sound did not interrupt the night. It blended into it, recognizable without demanding attention, leaving behind an impression rather than a clear image. Because the journey followed familiar routes, nothing felt staged. The rails had carried freight and passengers for years, and they carried this passage in the same way. That continuity mattered. It allowed the event to remain part of ordinary life, even as it marked something that would not easily settle into memory. When the train moved on, there was no signal that the moment had ended. People stayed where they were for a short while, then returned inside. Lamps were extinguished, doors closed, and the night resumed its usual pace. The absence of a clear ending made the experience feel unfinished, as though it had passed through rather than arrived. By the time the journey continued toward the next, it had already begun to change shape. What had been observed became something remembered. Details softened while the overall sense remained intact. The train had passed, yet the feeling of having witnessed something stayed behind, quiet and unresolved. For a long time after the journey ended, no one spoke about anything unusual. The funeral had passed, schedules returned, and attention moved elsewhere. Silence felt appropriate, even necessary. The loss was still too close to be shaped into commentary, and speaking too soon risked reducing it. What remained was an afterimage, indistinct and easily dismissed, waiting for distance to make it possible to mention without seeming improper. When remarks finally surfaced, they appeared without emphasis, Someone mentioned a familiar sound heard at an unfamiliar hour. Another listened, then let the thought pass. These exchanges did not seek agreement or correction. They functioned as acknowledgments, brief and careful, as if testing whether memory could be shared without being claimed or enlarged beyond proportion. People spoke in measured tones, careful not to exaggerate what they could not confirm. Railway workers were among the first to notice patterns. Engineers and signalmen knew the usual echoes of their routes, learned through repetition rather than study. When a rhythm appeared without record, it registered quietly. Comparisons were made later, away from duty, using ordinary language that described timing and movement while deliberately avoiding conclusions. People spoke in measured tones, careful not to exaggerate what they could not confirm. Some accounts spoke of lights seen at a distance, never close enough to define. Others described nothing visual at all, remembering only sound. The difference did not weaken the stories. It shaped them. What people recalled most was not a sight, but the sense of something passing through without interruption or invitation. People spoke in measured tones, careful not to exaggerate what they could not confirm. The restraint itself became part of what was remembered. In several towns, preparation had outpaced arrival. Lamps were lit, flowers arranged, and people waited longer than planned. When the train continued without stopping, the moment felt incomplete. Years later, these places repeated the memory with restraint, recalling a farewell that had been prepared for, but never fully allowed to settle. People spoke in measured tones, careful not to exaggerate what they could not confirm. The restraint itself became part of what was remembered. Not everyone accepted the stories. Many offered explanations grounded in experience and routine. Sound traveled differently at night. Wind altered distance. Memory replayed familiar patterns. These responses were reasonable and often correct. Yet explanation did not end conversation. It existed beside it, allowing the accounts to remain without demanding resolution. People spoke in measured tones, careful not to exaggerate what they could not confirm. What surprised later listeners was the tone of the retellings. No one described faces or named figures. The focus remained on movement and timing, on awareness rather than image. Fear did not dominate these accounts. Familiarity did. The language suggested recognition rather than warning, as if the experience belonged to routine more than disruption. People spoke in measured tones, careful not to exaggerate what they could not confirm. In boarding houses and depots, the topic surfaced briefly and then faded. A sentence was exchanged, a comparison offered, and the night continued. These stories did not seek attention or response. They appeared, were acknowledged, and then released, content to exist without insistence or follow-up. People spoke in measured tones, careful not to exaggerate what they could not confirm. The restraint itself became part of what was remembered. As years passed, phrasing grew consistent across places that had never coordinated. The sound was measured, the movement calm, the timing late. These similarities were noticed only afterward. At the time, the language felt natural, shaped by experience rather than intention, and shared without awareness of pattern. People spoke in measured tones, careful not to exaggerate what they could not confirm. The restraint itself became part of what was remembered. Some listeners remembered nothing unusual and said so plainly. Their certainty did not erase the story. It balanced it. The presence of absence kept accounts modest. No version claimed authority. The story endured because it allowed room for those who had experienced nothing at all to remain part of it. People spoke in measured tones, careful not to exaggerate what they could not confirm. The restraint itself became part of what was remembered. Attempts to document the reports rarely progressed. Dates shifted, times blurred, and urgency faded. Without pressure to conclude, the impulse to formalize weakened. What survived was conversation, carried lightly and released quickly, without expectation of permanence, verification, or proof. People spoke in measured tones, careful not to exaggerate what they could not confirm. The restraint itself became part of what was remembered. Because the accounts avoided spectacle, they resisted performance. Each telling ended without conclusion, often interrupted by ordinary matters. The lack of an ending preserved them. Without resolution, they remained flexible, able to fit different nights and different listeners without demanding belief. People spoke in measured tones, careful not to exaggerate what they could not confirm. The restraint itself became part of what was remembered. Only later did a name begin to circulate, and even then it was used sparingly. People preferred description to labels. Naming felt like commitment, and commitment felt out of proportion to what had been experienced. Remaining unnamed allowed the stories to move freely without expectation or defense. People spoke in measured tones, careful not to exaggerate what they could not confirm. The restraint itself became part of what was remembered. When the name did appear, it functioned as shorthand rather than judgment. It explained little and suggested much. Those who used it did so carefully, aware that clarity might reduce the experience to something smaller than it had felt when first remembered and shared. People spoke in measured tones, careful not to exaggerate what they could not confirm. The restraint itself became part of what was remembered. Nothing in these accounts sought to persuade anyone else. What endured was not belief, but repetition, calm observations shared across years accumulated without effort. Variety was essential. Each retelling differed slightly, confirming that the experience belonged to many, and therefore to no one in particular, resisting ownership or conclusion. People spoke in measured tones, careful not to exaggerate what they could not confirm. The restraint itself became part of what was remembered. By the time the accounts were recognized as stories, they had already settled into place. They no longer required witnesses. They survived because they had been carried without demand, allowing attention to come and go without consequence or obligation. People spoke in measured tones, careful not to exaggerate what they could not confirm. The restraint itself became part of what was remembered. Nothing in these accounts sought to persuade anyone else. Listeners encountering the stories for the first time often expected drama. They were surprised by how little was offered. No confrontation followed. Only a passing sense of recognition remained, made convincing by its restraint and careful proportion. People spoke in measured tones, careful not to exaggerate what they could not confirm. The restraint itself became part of what was remembered. Nothing in these accounts sought to persuade anyone else. Over time, the stories blended with routine. They were told while lights were lowered or tools set aside. Their timing mattered. They appeared when attention soft, when memory could be acknowledged without being examined too closely or forced into meaning. People spoke in measured tones, careful not to exaggerate what they could not confirm. The restraint itself became part of what was remembered. Nothing in these accounts sought to persuade anyone else. With time, events usually shrink. Dates settle into calendars, and names rest inside books. Yet some moments resist that process. They remain present not because they are unclear, but because they were shared too widely to belong to a single account. The stories that followed the journey endured in this way, carried not by certainty, but by the ease with which they could be mentioned, set aside, and returned to without insistence. History prefers clarity. It arranges events so they can be concluded and filed. Memory does not share this preference. It keeps what fits the feeling of an experience and releases what does not. This difference explains why certain accounts remain open. They are preserved not by precision alone, but by resonance, repetition, and the willingness to leave questions unsealed. People returned to these accounts quietly, often without announcing why they had thought of them again. Shared experiences behave differently from private ones. They linger between people rather than inside them. No single version defines them, and no witness claims authority. Instead, they persist through casual reference and quiet acknowledgement. In this way, memory becomes a space rather than a record, held together by tone and timing more than by detail. People return to these accounts quietly, often without announcing why they had thought of them again. As practical details thinned, sensation endured. What people remembered was not interruption, but continuity. The sound aligned with what had already been known, and familiarity allowed the memory to remain calm. It suggested that something had passed through without breaking the order of things or demanding response. People returned to these accounts quietly, often without announcing why they had thought of them again. The restraint shown in retelling became part of what made. Because nothing demanded action, the story required no resolution. There was no reason to decide what it meant or how it should be interpreted. Listeners were free to accept it briefly or ignore it entirely. This freedom prevented conflict and allowed the accounts to persist without resistance, correction, or debate. People returned to these accounts quietly, often without announcing why they had thought of them again. The restraint shown in retelling became part of what made. Over the years, the language surrounding the story grew simpler. Phrases shortened and details fell away. What remained was an outline flexible, enough to fit different nights and different listeners. By asking less, the story retained its ability to be noticed without effort or obligation. People returned to these accounts quietly, often without announcing why they had thought of them again. The restraint shown in retelling became part of what made the memory believable. When later historians searched for firm origins, they found little to hold. This absence was not failure. It reflected the nature of what had been shared. The experience had never aimed to be fixed or finalized. It belonged to conversation rather than documentation, and to memory rather than record. People returned to these accounts quietly, often without announcing why they had thought of them again. The restraint shown in retelling became part of what made the memory believe. Stories that survive in this way often remain at the edges of attention. They appear when light is low and effort minimal. They do not compete with the day. They accompany it, traveling quietly beside ordinary routines without altering their course or demanding recognition. People return to these accounts quietly, often without announcing why they had thought of them again. The restraint shown in retelling became part of what made the memory believable. In the evenings, such stories feel closer. The mind loosens its insistence on order and sequence. Memory moves by association rather than chronology. In this state, incomplete accounts feel appropriate, mirroring how recollection works when it is allowed to rest without correction. People return to these accounts quietly, often without announcing why they had thought of them again. The restraint shown in retelling became part of what made the memory believable. The train story endured because it matched this rhythm. It neither startled nor reassured. It aligned with how people already remembered the loss that preceded it. By avoiding instruction or symbol, it remained descriptive, tied to experience rather than interpretation or conclusion. People returned to these accounts quietly, often without announcing why they had thought of them again. The restraint shown in retelling became part of what made the memory believable. Eventually, even stories learn how to rest. They stop expanding and settle into a familiar shape. The train does not return. The sound fades. The tracks remain. What persists is not the event itself, but the permission to remember it without pressure, explanation, or demand. People returned to these accounts quietly, often without announcing why they had thought of them again. The restraint shown in retelling became part of what made the memory believable. Morning always arrives without comment. Work resumes and schedules return. History continues forward, unaware of the quieter narratives traveling alongside it. These stories do not seek attention. They exist independently of belief, sustained by repetition rather than proof or argument. People return to these accounts quietly, often without announcing why they had thought of them again. The restraint shown in retelling became part of what made the memory believable. No final account resolves the matter. No conclusion is required. The absence of closure is not weakness. It is what keeps the story gentle. Without insistence, it avoids dispute and remains available to anyone who encounters it in the right moment and allows it to pass. People returned to these accounts quietly, often without announcing why they had thought of them again. The restraint shown in retelling became part of what made the memory believable. As attention softens, the story can be heard without effort. It does not demand agreement or refusal. It waits in the background, like certain memories that surface only when conditions are calm enough to receive them without disturbance or urgency. People return to these accounts quietly, often without announcing why they had thought of them again. The restraint shown in retelling became part of what made the memory believable. Some stories are remembered not because they returned, but because they were never fully left behind. They remain adjacent to experience, close enough to be noticed, distant enough to avoid intrusion. In this balance, they find longevity without becoming burdensome. People returned to these accounts quietly, often without announcing why they had thought of them again. The restraint shown in retelling became part of what made the memory believable. In this way, the night becomes an ally of memory. Darkness reduces urgency and sharpness. It allows edges to blur without erasing form. The story belongs to this space, where clarity is unnecessary and presence alone is sufficient. People returned to these accounts quietly, often without announcing why they had thought of them again. The restraint shown in retelling became part of what made the memory believable. Nothing in these moments asked to be resolved or clarified first. As sleep approaches, attention narrows and thoughts simplify. In this state, stories that ask little feel appropriate. They do not compete for focus. They accompany it, providing a gentle structure for letting go rather than holding on to meaning. People return to these accounts quietly, often without announcing why they had thought of them again. The restraint shown in retelling became part of what made the memory believable. Here, at the edge of waking and rest, the story ends without ending, not with certainty and not with doubt, but with acceptance. Some things are carried forward not to be solved, but to be allowed. The train has passed. The night continues. People returned to these accounts quietly, often without announcing why they had thought of them again. The restraint shown in retelling became part of what made the memory believable. Nothing in these moments asked to be resolved or